you the aims of the event. Today's webinar focuses on Sex and Gender-Based Analysis Plus, also known as SGBA Plus, and it showcases CRISM Atlantic's Sex and Gender Advisory Council's leadership in this crucial area. The event is consistent with CRISM's training mandate and benefited from the administrative support from our new CRISM training support platform. Our first presentation is led by representatives from the CIHR Institute of Gender and Health, and that first presentation is going to aim to introduce key definitions and concepts of sex and gender, emphasizing the importance of Sex and Gender-Based Analysis Plus and its integration into health research broadly. And then we're going to follow that introductory talk by two presentations from substance use research leaders in Canada who are going to illustrate their experiences and describe their methodologies for incorporating SGBA Plus within their research programs on substance-related issues. And that part aligns more closely with CRISM's objectives. So as you can see, we're bringing together the objectives of the Institute for Gender and Health and the objectives of CRISM. So now I'd like to introduce the co-chairs of CRISM Atlantic's Sex and Gender Advisory Council, Drs. Kaida and Gehagen, who will be serving as moderators of today's event. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Nikki Kapek, an occupational scientist at Dalhousie University, and she's dedicated to untangling knowledge and exploring the intricacies of substance use, mental health, and healthcare responses. By employing diverse methods such as interviews, surveys, and critical discourse analysis, she investigates gendered meanings and experiences, providing a platform for understanding beneficial and non-problematic substance use, addiction, harm reduction, decriminalization, and the social sanctioning of occupation, all framed within an anti-oppressive, anti-racist, and decolonizing approach. And our second moderator is Dr. Jacqueline Gehagen. Dr. Gehagen, Associate Vice President of Research at Mount St. Vincent University, brings over 20 years of extensive research experience in the areas of public health and the social sciences, both locally and internationally. With a background in medical sociology, Dr. Gehagen's research interests span substance use, mental health, and addiction medicine, and they are committed to addressing disparities related to sex and gender issues, mainly focusing on the LGBTQ plus communities and other marginalized populations. So now I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Gehagen to introduce our first speakers.
Thanks very much, Sherry. Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Angela Kaida, who is the Scientific Director of the Institute of Gender and Health at the Canadian Institutes of Health Research as of July 1st, 2023. As Scientific Director, Angela will develop and advance research and training initiatives that address gender, sex, and health research priorities in Canada while supporting the implementation of CIHR's strategic plan. And I would also like to introduce our second speaker from CIHR IGH, Dr. Elsabe du Plessis, who is the Sex and Gender Plus Science Strategy Lead at the CIHR Institute of Gender and Health, and Dr. du Plessis is a sex and gender lead where she undertakes research on behalf of IGH in areas that are critical to global health studies and understanding power and inequity in global health. And obviously with a focus on sex and gender being critical dimensions and how they shape people's access to power and their ability to meet their rights, including the right to health. It's my pleasure then to turn the floor over to Angela and Elsabe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much to CRISM for inviting us to be part of this webinar, and truly gratitude and thanks to all of you for joining us today on this conversation about integrating sex and gender into health research. As Jackie has mentioned, I'm Angela Kaida. I'm the Scientific Director of the Institute of Gender and Health, and I'm here with my colleague Elsabe du Plessis. So I'm gonna get us started here. I will note that I'm joining you all from the unceded ancestral and traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, which includes the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations. It is a dreary day here on the Pacific West Coast, but it is, as usual, gorgeous. I'm sorry to tell you all that it still remains gorgeous here, even if it's dreary. And I want to start with data from your own field. This is not my field of research, but really this is data from the Public Health Agency of Canada, which reports that there is a total of 47,162 apparent opioid toxicity deaths between Jan 2016 and the latest data of March 2024. This is a pretty simple figure, but startling, distressing nonetheless. We see a picture of heartbreak and loss, and as well as a picture of sex differences as presented here by the Public Health Agency of Canada. And we can see that across all of these years, about 70% of all deaths from apparent opioid toxicity occur among males, and about 30% occur among females. And that's really quite remarkably consistent over the years. This proportion changes province to province, where we see in places in Saskatchewan where the proportion is more similar between males and females. And this figure uses the language of sex, right? Showing us the data by males and females. But really the question is why? Why do we see this pattern? Are these differences really about sex differences in terms of how we might metabolize drugs differently? Or are these differences actually about gender in terms of masculinities and how we enact our gender in terms of how our gender shapes our access to care, our access to harm reduction services, our behaviors when it comes to substance use? Or are these patterns really a mix between both sex and gender and their interaction and how they might shape both drug use, access to care, and death? And so I want to sort of start there because as part of my presentation today, I wanted to invite you to reflect with me on three things. The first is that I wanted to share about the sex and gender integration policy at CIHR. As researchers, I know you are all familiar with it, but I wanted to bring some data to this conversation as well, show you what we're looking at in the background. I wanted to provide some definitions and information about sex, gender, and this SGBA plus analyses in health research. A very kind of short how-to, given the time that we have before handing it over to the experts, and then sharing with you what we call our IGH Research Priority Plan, which is really our strategic plan for the next 5 years that can help you as a research community understand what types of funding opportunities are going to be coming out of IGH that you might be interested in and might be relevant to you in the coming years. So let me start by saying, I think all of you know that CIHR, here we are, we're composed of 13 virtual institutes with quite wide-ranging mandates. And here we are at IGH over here, one of these 13. And our institute mandate is to support research excellence regarding the influence of sex and gender on health, but also to apply these findings to identify and address pressing health challenges facing men, women, girls, boys, and gender diverse people. And because of this mandate, we're unique in the sense that everybody's research is about sex and gender, whether they think it is or not. And really, we cut across all 4 pillars of health research. I find that to be a really exciting part of what we do, but a bit of a, I find people are not sure if they are the IGH community or not. So let this serve as your official invitation to be a member of the IGH community. I also wanted to share with you, just pull back the curtain a little bit about who it is when we talk about IGH, who's responding to your emails, who's going to pick up the phone. So you can see myself here. Elder Sheila Nyman, who opened us so beautifully this morning, is our Elder-in Residence with the Institute and has been with us since the beginning, since the Institute moved here to Vancouver. We have our Associate Director, Glennis Webster, our Admin Coordinator, Jem Lee, our Communications and Partnership Engagement Lead, Jacqueline Salome, and our Sex and Gender Science Strategy Lead, Elsabe du Plessis, who's joining us on this call as well today. And I want to share that for us at IGH, we really see ourselves as more than a funder. We really are the institute that has led the CIHR policy around integrating sex and gender across CIHR funded research. Some of you might think that that is a good thing. Some of you might think that's not a good thing, but that it has been a big part of our role at CIHR. And I wanted to share this data that says of all CIHR research investments over the last 10 years, let's say, you can see what's happened over time in terms of the percentage of our investments. So these are successful grants, money that's gone out the door, that have addressed sex and or gender considerations, at least in their grant application. And Jackie already signaled to this around, how do we make sure we're going from grant application all the way through to our research, to our publication? And I'll get into that in a moment. But you can see a lot of this change has been driven by researchers considering sex in their research and their analyses. And that's because most of the research that CIHR funds is in a biomedical domain. So people working with cells, tissues, animal models. And then you can see we have seen also an increase in the proportion that have considered gender over time. And so what we now know is that when peer reviewers assess the integration of sex and or gender as a strength of the proposal, we know that this yields an increased odds of that proposal being funded. So having a strong sex or gender consideration across your proposal that's evaluated by peer reviewers increases odds of funding, which is, of course, what we all want. And I think it's important for me to remind everybody that why we have this policy is really about making the science that CIHR funds more rigorous, more inclusive, more representative of the Canadian population and needs, health priorities, and lived and living experiences. And this is also a policy that aims at opening the door to scientific discovery. So I want to make sure I leave you with a message of this policy is not about a checkbox exercise to administratively do X, Y, Z. It is actually about the science itself. And so let me talk a bit then about what this all means. What is sex? What is gender? Are they the same thing? I think we've got, I'm a bit preaching to the choir for those of you who have shown up today for this webinar by CRISM, but really to make sure that we all are clear that sex and gender are not the same thing. They're not interchangeable. They can be related often, but they aren't the same thing. And I find it really helpful to think about sex and gender in its components. So sex being about biological attributes of humans and animals, whether that's physical features, chromosomes, gene expression, hormones, anatomy, physiology. Whereas gender is really is a social construction, and it might speak to our roles in our communities, in our society, in our families, our behaviors, our expressions, our identities. And the language of gender we use is around talking about girls, boys, men, women, gender diverse people. And so as I mentioned, sex and its dimensions are important for health. I think a lot of us, including what I did in that first slide, is to show, a binary construction of sex. This happens in males, this happens in females, and then we carry on. But actually, if we're going to try to understand more deeply the mechanisms, how is it that sex shapes our health outcomes? We really need to think about its dimensions and which of these dimensions might be most influential in our particular research. And when it comes to substance use research in Canada, of course, our colleague Lauren Graves has just done such beautiful work in this space, and I don't want to steal her thunder, but one of the things that I feel like research does so well and so accessibly is to show us, okay, when we are thinking about sex-related factors that might, in this case, influence alcohol use disorder, can we break it down? How might sex-related factors that are related to hormones influence alcohol use disorder? Genes, physiology, anatomy, neurobiology, and really starting to unpack how these different factors then might be associated, might be mechanisms or causal pathways to some of the sex-related differences that we see in health outcomes. And so in a similar way, it's important and I think really helpful to break down gender and its dimensions to understand what are the pathways through which gender might be influencing health and health outcomes. And when we talk about gender and its components, others, I find it helpful to think about gender in its multi-dimensionality. So sometimes we get caught up in a bit of that gender is gender identity, which it's not. Gender identity is one component, is one dimension of gender, but it's not gender. So I think here where we think about gender identity and we think about this as, you know, our inner sense of self as being masculine, feminine, both, neither, somewhere on a spectrum. And some language that we tend to use in a gender identity component is around cisgender, transgender, gender diverse, gender non-conforming, gender expansive, really evolving language in this space. But then we also need to think about gender roles. Is that the element of gender that might be shaping our health outcomes, our access to health services, whether we prioritize our own health over other people's health in our caregiving circles? And we can then think about gender relations, what happens in workplace dynamics that might occupationally expose us to different types of risks or protections based on our gender and gender relation dynamics. And then this overarching considerations of institutionalized gender. This is about the distribution of power in political spaces, in societal institutions that might then function to affect our health. So when we think about, you know, pay inequities as an example, or family leave policies as an example, and how those might shape our health. So this is really to say that gender is really complex. And I think we've got to be willing as scientists to sit in that space of complexity and think about how it shows up and what parts of it show up in the research questions that we're pursuing. So these are a few features, is that it's non-binary, which means we're used to seeing our research results by, you know, this happens for women, this happens for men, but we know that gender is much more expansive than that. It can change over time. It's intersectional in the sense that the experience of what it might be to be a racialized woman, you know, living in an urban environment relative to a non-racialized woman living in a rural community. Like, gender intersects with different identities and social positions to further influence and shape our health. As I've said, it's socially constructed. So if you move in different social environments or into different geographies, the experience of your gender, the role expectation, how you can express your gender may similarly change. And I think it's important to remind us all that gender is not the same as sexual orientation. They are related, but they are not, they're not the same concept. So really that it is a complex variable to integrate into research. And again, I've turned to an example from Lorraine Gray's work where she and her team, where they do this really, again, really kind of concrete way of visualizing. You know, here is an example of how gender-related factors might impact alcohol use and alcohol-related harms. So I'll just pull one example here from the gender roles kind of quadrant of this figure, where you know, this literature review really talks about that women may use alcohol to cope with stress of caregiving roles, trauma, and intimate partner violence in a way that is related to their the expectations of their roles in communities, in society, within partnerships, within families. So again, I don't want to steal her thunder. I know she'll go into this in more detail. And then I think it's important that I say that in research with humans, sex and gender related factors overlap. So we get into a little bit more complexity here, but also a real opportunity for discovery. So we can move in this by thinking about this overlap and these factors rather than gender and sex as binary kind of heteronormative or normative constructs. We can really start to think about what are the sex and gender related factors that might explain why we see differences, to help us explain areas where we might actually see similarities, can help us, you know, kind of zero in a bit more on what are the causal pathways rather than just disparity research. What are some of the causal pathways that are generating the differences that we're seeing? And are these differences meaningful, and can we do something about it? At the end of the day, you know, Sheila and others will always challenge us around what is the impact of this work? What's changing because we're doing the work? So I think focusing this, to me, this kind of thinking helps me think about more solutions rather than documenting disparities. And so What we also have shown here in this figure is, rather than thinking, okay, this is just the sex disparity, this is the gender disparity, we're really trying to show this plus, the gender plus, which really recognizes that gender does intersect with other social identities and positions to shape our health. And in some questions that you might be pursuing, sex and gender may not be the overwhelming identity or position that shapes the health outcome that you're interested in. It might actually be gender and ethnicity, or gender and age, or socioeconomic status. And to me, this kind of visual helps me think about what is the kind of factor that I'm interested in, or that I think is really influencing, or I want to test its influence on the outcomes and experiences that I'm looking at in my own research. And so when we put all of this together, this is how we start to talk about SGBA plus, or sex and gender-based analysis. And at its basics, the SGBA plus is an analytic approach that systematically integrates sex and gender and other diversity dimensions, that's that plus, throughout all stages of the research. So this thinking really starts at your research question and your literature review. Are there sex and gender considerations in the literature of the area that your research focuses on? Do you have a research design and maybe a recruitment strategy that is going to enable you to look at and examine sex and gender plus related questions? Are you recruiting, sufficient numbers of gender of people of different genders, if gender is an analytic interest of yours? Are you collecting data in a way that asks about gender in an inclusive way that allows folks to share their own experiences of their gender? Are you collecting, and do you need to collect data on sex assigned at birth or legal sex, or what is the variable on sex and gender that is important in your research? And then, of course, as we come to our data analyses, are we at the least doing data analyses that disaggregate the findings by sex and or gender to enable, rather than, we often control for or treat gender and sex as a confounder, but really rather creating an analysis plan where we can look at whether an outcome might differ by sex and gender. And taking that all the way through into how we report our findings, how we publish the results, and then, of course, how we mobilize what we're finding into action, whether that's policy or clinical guidelines or training materials, et cetera. And really thinking about SGBA plus as not just that box in the CIHR application process, but really throughout all of the stages of our research. And so I have here, I've got an example of a sex analysis and reporting in science that is from an article that my predecessor, Kara Tenenbaum, and her team published back in 2019 in Nature, that really provides like a flow chart. I think a really simple way of thinking through how, like a decision tree, let me say. So starting with the question of, will the phenomenon or product under study affect organisms with biological sex? And if no, you can stop there. If there isn't that question, you can stop there. But if yes, do you have enough numbers for inclusion in your experiences? Do you analyze by sex? Does a difference exist when data are disaggregated by sex? Can you determine the source of that sex difference? So rather than ending here to say this happens in males, this happens in females, can you speak to what might be the source of that difference? And then reporting your findings by sex to explain an underlying mechanism. And then, even if you do not find a difference by sex, reporting that sex difference don't exist. That is important data as well. So I've also included in my slides a similar flow chart or decision tree by gender, but I'll move to the final section of I've got just 2 minutes here. So I just want to share with you the final section of my presentation to share with you what is happening at IGH. So many of you, I hope, were part of or contributed to our national listening tour, which we undertook last year, crisscrossing the country and different communities to talk to folks about where are we at in a sex, gender, and health science space? What are our responsibilities as an institute? And where should we be investing our time and resources for the coming 5 years? So we used the information from that national listening tour to develop our new research priority plan, which we've titled Strengths to Solutions, Advancing Sex and Gender Science for Healthy Futures. And I won't go through all of these in particular, but I do want to just point you to, we've really put forward some values that are going to ground the work of our institute as we go forward. Many of that I've already kind of hinted at throughout my presentation, including enriching our work by the lens and tools of intersectionality, being inclusive of community research partners, being strength-based, being supportive of studying small populations deeply. And so, Elsabe will put a link to our plan in the chat so you can look at it more closely if you haven't seen it. But I want to flag 3 priorities here that we've outlined. The first one is to continue driving systemic change for sex and gender plus integration. That's much of the work that I presented here today. And we'll be providing training opportunities and additional ways for our research community to be involved in supporting and advancing systemic change for sex and gender integration across the health research ecosystem. But we've put forward a second priority, which acknowledges that advancing sex and gender science is an area of deep scholarship, and it's going to need directed investment for us to advance this mechanistic investigation of how and when and why do sex and gender related factors shape our health, really focused in on mechanisms and processes. So we'll be releasing specific funding opportunities in this space as well. And then finally, we have committed to investing in sex and gender research for health equity. And here we've identified 3 widely supported areas of focus for our research investments, including Two-Spirit and LGBTQI+ health, women's health, and gender and health within Indigenous and Black communities. We really see ourselves as IGH as having a responsibility for advancing work in service, research in service of the health priorities and needs of these specific communities. And I'll end here by just turning your attention to, we do have a few funding opportunities that are currently live in case you're not aware of them, but the first one is planning and dissemination grants. We have at least 5 awards, some restricted to research focused on areas of priority within our research priority plan. We've increased the amount to $50,000 per award, acknowledging that so much of what is necessary in community engaged work costs more. And so making sure that you know about that. A Healthy Youth Team Grant that we are funding, and we are funding a specific pool on trans, non-binary, and Two-Spirit youth health. And then some funding opportunities for trainees in particular, ensuring that those trainees, doctoral students, master's students that are doing work in sex, gender, and intersectionality know that we have priority announcements available for those who are doing work in this space. And then coming soon, we hosted our first Summer Institute this year in Vancouver, and we will be hosting the 2025 Summer Institute in June of next year. And please watch out for a travel award opportunity for you and your trainees to attend and participate in that Summer Institute to advance our collective learning. I'll leave it there with a thank you and an invitation to stay in touch with us. And I'll look forward to the questions near the end of today's session.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela. That was an amazing presentation. Very grateful for your time with us here today. And it's my understanding that we are moving over to hear from Dr. Lorraine Breen. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Nikki for the introduction. Thank you.
Thank you for this. It's a great pleasure to be here, and to it's also nice to see all the attendees online and the different names, different departments people are coming from, and to have us all together here is really fun on a rainy day. I think it sounds like across a lot of the country. So I'll pass this over to Dr. Lorraine Greaves. Dr. Greaves is a medical sociologist and a senior investigator at the Center of Excellence for Women's Health. She has extensive experience in analyzing tobacco, cannabis, alcohol, and other substance use, and integrating sex, gender, and equity into research about policy development. Dr. Greaves has received prestigious awards, including the Outstanding Ontario Achievement Award and the Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Network of Women Against Tobacco. She's also a published author of many reports, articles, and 12 books, of which I imagine a lot of people on here have read at least some of that work. So we're really happy to have you here. Thank you.
Well, great. Thank you very much. I'm hoping you can see those slides now.
Yes.
Great. All right. I'm talking today about sex, gender, and substance use. I am from the Center of Excellence for Women's Health in Vancouver, Canada, which is a virtual research center based on the lands of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. I am speaking to you today, however, from Southern Ontario, in what's called the Haldimand Tract, 6 miles either side of the Grand River, which was previously signed in 1784, an agreement which is, still under a lot of land claim disputes as we go forward today. So I just want to start with this slide here saying at the Center of Excellence for Women's Health, we're in our 27th year of operation. And we have 3 main approaches, some of which you've just heard about from Angela. One is the building of sex and gender science, which is, to me, sort of very fundamental to what we want to do here in substance use and any other issue in health. We also use SGBA Plus to identify differential impacts of all kinds of aspects of gender and sex. And third, which we haven't talked about yet today, we prioritize gender transformative solutions that really improve gender equity as well. And on the right, we've had a long-standing involvement model to try and hear from all kinds of different people as we do that work. I'm going to frame what I'm talking about today in this recent article that Stacey Ritz at McMaster and I did 2 years ago, where we wanted to sort of generate some precision about what we're talking about in sex, gender, and health, and to try and map the landscape. And more recently, I've prepared this visual of that paper. So if you're interested in reading the paper, you can. There's a citation at the bottom. If you're interested in just this visual, you can pick it up off our website at cwh.ca. As going forward, all the things I show you today, or most of them, will be on that website. So I'm going to talk about sex and gender science first, the purple box with the green intersectional analysis box underneath it. And I'm going to give some examples of some of the work we've done over the years in this area with respect to substance use. And you'll see there are 4 different categories there. They're not mutually exclusive. I'm sure they're not collectively exhaustive, but this was our attempt to bring some order to what it is we're all talking about when we talk about things like sex and gender science, or things like policy approaches like SGBA Plus or EDI. So let's dig in. You've seen this already as illustrated on alcohol, but this is the basic diagram. Again, if you want this figure, you can get it. And also on our website, we've got a template around this figure where you can get this and apply it. You can work with it based on your own research study. This you've already seen. This was published 2 years ago as well, but it also is part of a big report for the CCSA on the low-risk drinking guidelines paper on women. We've since done a paper on men. and males, and that paper is just in press this week. So this would be the example of the males. That's in the Journal of Men's Health, coming up. I think it should be published this week or next week. And here, it's just interesting for you to begin to plot out, not just what do we know already in these areas, as Angela described, but I like to say, go a step back and say, what aspect of sex might you be interested in your research study? Is it something hormonal? Is it something genetic? Is it something else? And these are sex-related factors. You notice I don't say sex differences, because most of these things are not completely different or in two separate categories, but rather most of these things may overlap between males and females. Similarly with gender, you've seen this diagram already. Here it is applied to women, which you've seen already. I'll be giving you some more examples of some work we've done where we've honed in on one or more of these quadrants in a particular study. But you can see here, for example, I think we often forget the institutional impacts of gender. Child welfare policy and child apprehension policy, for example, really affects women who are either pregnant or already mothers in terms of seeking help. And quite rationally, women in those positions are afraid to seek treatment because they're afraid of child welfare policy, or they're afraid of further stigmatization. So this is an illustration of the institutional impact that's gendered, that really does have an impact on, in this case, not just alcohol, but any drug use, and whether or not people access treatment. You'll see with the relationship you might have in a closer proximity, say with a partner or in a household, has an impact on how you use. And similarly, I've done this one as the part of the recent paper in the Journal of Men's Health, which talks about gender-related factors in alcohol in men. And you can see we've also put in some examples. Binge drinking, for example, is much more acceptable among men across cultures. And there are occupational differences. Institutional issues, men are not typically included in reproductive health care programming, which is something I'd like to see changed, because substance use affects reproductive health in males as well as females, and so on. You can see that alcohol use can contribute to sexual assault and IPV. But one of the more interesting things about men, women, and gender diverse people is that one's gender identity has an impact based on your adherence to traditional masculinities or femininities, has an impact on how much you use alcohol. So there are lots and lots of avenues here. But as I just mentioned, this is really not about a binary, either in the sex department or the gender department. These things not only overlap, but rather males and females in the sex categories may overlap in certain ways. Just as you can imagine, we often like to say, well, most females weigh less than most males, but there are lots of males and females in the middle that will cross over in that diagram. So really the interesting part is, as mentioned, is the sex and gender interactions. And this will affect all gender groups. So there's sex and gender impact when we think about not just sexual assault, but fighting or aggression or intimate partner violence for both men and women and gender diverse people. There's a sex gender impact on reproductive health for everybody. And there's sex gender interactions with the degree of adherence, as just stated, to masculinity or femininity. So when we did these major reviews of alcohol use for the CCSA recently, and this was in the context of the new alcohol use guidelines, we found quite interestingly when we apply an SGBA plus analysis to the existing evidence, which is a common thing we do at the Center of Excellence, we find that sex is really a key variable for transmitting messaging to women. And that is because the risk for females of drinking alcohol is much higher on lower amounts, much more damage occurs to the female body. Much more intoxication more quickly occurs in the female body when compared to male bodies. And a lot of females and women don't know that. Certainly a lot of healthcare providers don't necessarily transmit that. So sex and female risk became a major message in terms of recommending lower consumption. Alternatively, when we analyzed all the material on males and men, we found that the major risk issues are in the gender domain, really, on the impact of masculinities, which affects binging, context, competitive drinking, and a host of other things. So if you want to read more about the sex risk story and the gender risk story, you can do that. Those are the citations right there. As I said, the second one should be out this week. Just to show you how this can be applied to any substance, I'll just show you this one slide that sex-related factors matter in tobacco and nicotine use as well, in that there are differential responses to nicotine in the body in terms of how it's processed. Male and female differences. And you can also see that hormones affect the metabolization of nicotine. And the responses to NRT are different for females and males. And, you know, we think underlying the difficulties that a lot of women have with cessation are some of these factors. In the gender area, it's no surprise to any of us that marketing and product development have been targeted, not just to women and girls, but to men and boys. And that is carrying on now with vaping products that are transmitting images to young people in particular. But we do find when we do gender-based research on these issues that the attachment or meaning of smoking and vaping is different for men and women. And we think gender diverse people need to do that work. And that there are obvious responses to pressures like poverty and food insecurity and occupation and stress that go into the response that's gender-based regarding tobacco use. And then just to tell you that it's really the sex-gender interaction that matters here. And we did a study some years ago with Joan Batorf and her team at UBC, looking at couple dynamics in tobacco reduction during pregnancy. And we published this booklet that you see the cover of here. And we found that there were varied gendered responses depending on whether or not and these were all heterosexual couples, whether or not the woman was trying to quit or didn't smoke and didn't want the other partner to smoke, or vice versa, or they both smoked or they both wanted to quit, every combination. And we linked that to, through qualitative research, linked that to varying dynamics that occur. And that booklet describes those as educating for women. So it's not about cessation, it's about those dynamics that they might want to think about. And then last but not least, some of you may know that exposure to secondhand smoke is gendered. 2/3 of mortality of SHS is women across the world. So far, let's go back to this diagram. I've talked about sex and or gender differences. These are comparative studies. Sex and or gender related factors. This is about the mechanisms and processes such as, metabolism, for example. Sex and gender interactions, which looks at the real world relationships that I've illustrated. And I'm going to come now to the section of gender minority group research. But just to show you that not one of these is really enough, but it's really important not to stop at number one. In the field of sex and gender science, we started with sex differences. And that was the beginning point. And that's not to be ignored, but it's not enough. We need to go through all of these, or even start with 2 or 3 or 4 as a way of diving into this area. And of course, all of this is recognizing that there are multiple factors, as has been discussed, and identities that are going to impact in each of those. And that's a really useful diagram from Creole that you can get off their website, which I think really well illustrates not just identity, but the systems of power and the structures that surround all of us differentially. So I really encourage you to think about all of this as you come up with your particular research question. Now, this category is somewhat newer. In the last 5 or 7 years has really grown and continues to grow. And as mentioned, some of the issues are still pretty fundamental here, not conflating gender with gender identity, which I still see all the time, but also trying to clarify categories and definitions so that people can begin to do research that is comparative and reproducible. But having said that, there are some basic attempts being made now to talk about differential patterns, contexts, risks, or differences. So it's that differences research among sexual orientation groups and among gender identity groups to try and get a handle on how sexual substance use is distributed. And then keeping in mind all the impact of structural processes, such as those on the diagram I've just showed you. And then last but not least, do not forget that if you're working in this category, always report on your SGBA plus of sex and gender minority evidence. So often I see somebody do work in this category and then end up making conclusions about heterosexual or homosexual or gay or lesbian or non-binary without necessarily reporting on some of the sex and or gender qualities of that part of their sample. And this becomes really important when you think about transgender people, where you might want to think through the impact of aspects of their sex-based body, as well as aspects of their gender identity, and how those two things interact to create a result or create risk or create difference. So here's another one. I think this is in press this week as well, or it might just be published, I'm not sure. Another one we did recently where we were interested in taking a look at meth intervention treatment and to try and figure out what did we already know. And this is the kind of work we often do at the center to figure out, well, what do we already know about this? So we can start there. And sadly, here's an example where we know very little. We did a scoping review. We only ended up with 24 studies. Only 10 of them were intervention studies, which was our primary research question. They all focused on men who have sex with men and essentially in the context of chemsex. But there was no sex and gender information more generally. There was no more general sexual orientation or even gender identity categorization in the literature. So essentially, we know very little about what works with intervention for meth treatment. We also had a second question looking at sex, gender, trauma, and equity factors that might be reported on. Again, there was a conflation of terms. There was a little bit of transgender people included, but no analysis of it, and little discussion of female-oriented treatment or women. And yet, we already know that women start meth use earlier and ask for treatment more often. So here's an example of a review to find out what we know. It has implications for all of those categories I've already mentioned: differences, factors, responses, gender and sexual minority, but we really didn't find a lot. Anyway, you can read about that. And last but not least, in terms of measurement, there's a lot going on in this area in sexual and gender minority health. Here's a great article here. Actually, it's a big report that you might want to look at if you're thinking about categories. And another interesting set of learning tools from the CGSEH in UBC, looking at measurement. So you'll notice that there was, on my initial slide, 2 circles on the right-hand side, one called SGBA plus and one called EDI. I'm not going to do EDI today, but again, if you want this figure for your own work, you can get this off our website. And I think it's worth talking a little bit about SGBA plus. It's a process. It's an analytic process that you can apply, as I've just illustrated, to existing evidence, or to a policy, or to a program, or to clinical guidelines, or to whatever you want. It means that it's sex-informed, gender-informed, and equity-informed. Now, it's the orange part of this that I really want to talk about. It requires familiarity with the evidence, but also with critical thinking, lateral thinking, and your ability to compare related issues. I'll give you a quick example. We don't know a whole lot yet about cannabis use and sex and gender, or vaping, nicotine and sex and gender. We're beginning to work on those things. But we do know a lot about nicotine and tobacco smoking. And that's an area where we have spent a lot of time doing lateral thinking. What do we know about tobacco and nicotine that we could transfer and test out with respect to cannabis and vaping? That's just one example. And don't be afraid to speculate about future impacts. That's the beauty and the glory of SGBA+. So how do we use this in research? As a framework for scoping reviews or other systematic reviews, which I've just illustrated to you, and assessing methods, analyses, and reporting, and determining KT products and audiences. This is a super important part of the work that we do at the Center of Excellence, working really hard to try and figure out, what does this mean with respect to clinical guidelines, or to educating healthcare providers, or educating the general public? What does this mean for policymakers? And so all of those are totally useful and totally necessary things. So just to sort of wrap up some of these examples, the sex and gender entanglements, or these interactions, the complexities that Angela talked about, is where we're at now. Don't let this scare you, but this is the real life. So these affect what we do in practice or what we do in policymaking. I've mentioned vaping, for example. Our policy in Canada was way behind. We are all paying for that now, as we know. We've recently done a study on vaping, smoking, and pregnancies, soon to be published, asking lots about women and why they were doing what they're doing. And they talk about how it's stigma reducing to actually do that. Reducing prescription opioid use. Prescription opioid is the highest risk factor for opioid addiction in women, even though we know the majority of poisonings are among men. And so on. You can see how, when you think about these entanglements, you get into really critical research areas, critical policy areas. For example, with recreational cannabis use, there's a paper we did a while back, I think 3 or 4 years ago, when cannabis was just legalized, looking at 3 things. How does it work with respect to developing cannabis use disorder? How does it work with respect to the policy of impaired driving? How does it work with respect to pregnancy and vaping? And, you know, you can see these you can't talk about as just sex or just gender. These are sex-gender interactions. But they tell us, they point to us in a variety of ways that the routes of administration of cannabis really do matter. They're gendered, for example, but we also think that's linked to sex-related factors in the way cannabis is received by the body. We know in pretty well every substance we've looked at, women telescope faster to a disorder state and are more sensitive to substances than are males. We know that in pretty well all substances, and more damage is done on lesser amounts. We also know in the bottom green sections here, women experience way more stigma, and that has an impact on how they seek treatment. But with respect to cannabis, it's impacted what the route of administration is. So on it goes. You can see just in this one slide, 100 research questions pop up. So last section, I'm going to quickly move through the equity part, which is the gender transformative section of the diagram. We're interested in improving outcomes all the time. That is, for example, reducing the impact of alcohol on women or men. Improving gender equity also at the same time equals gender transformative thinking. So we're not just doing one thing. I mean, you can perhaps reduce the impact of alcohol with a gender group in a way, but it might not help them achieve gender equity or improve their gender equity. In fact, we could be exploiting it or accommodating or transforming. I'll give you one quick example. In the past, we would often try and reduce, for example, teenage girls smoking by saying it's unattractive to men. That is a gender exploitative approach that we would not, I hope, do today, because it doesn't improve girls or women's gender equity by using that. In fact, it reinforces negative stereotypes and sees them in relation to their sexual attractiveness. What we're aiming for is the green bit, addressing the root causes and figuring out ways that we can assist with improving those along with our impact. Here are some of, this is a very big field, by the way. It's one that I work in primarily. We've done a lot of work on gender transformative approaches to health, the center, and you can read about that on our website. Mostly, gender transformative approaches have tried to appeal to men and males to change their ways in terms of improving equity. I'm arguing now that we need to broaden our audiences to be men, women, and gender diverse people, and start critically assessing femininities as well as masculinities, which we've done a lot of. And naming agency is a key driver of change here. And understanding how lots of system issues or processes that are social, like, or ideological, like femphobia, misogyny, or sexism, or racism, affect all of us. And so I'm just going to leave you with this kind of complicated thought that I've just written about, which will be published in January. How might men, women, sexual and gender minorities respond to hegemonic masculinities and femininities? And how might we begin to shift our thinking and invoke some agency among all gender groups for addressing these issues? And that is in a chapter. You can see the name of it there. I hope you'll be able to read it when it comes out. It's open access. And it's really taking these ideas about gender transformative thinking a step further to try and figure out how can we make more equitable policy and practice for all genders. So if I can leave you with one thing, it's to do more substance use research. A lot of substance use research is done without sex and gender. And we did a special issue at the IJERPH about 5 years ago, I think it was, asking where was the sex and gender in substance use research? And, you know, the editorial was entitled Missing in Action. So I implore you to involve sex and gender in your research. But as important, I implore you to report it. How many studies, I cannot tell you how many studies I have read where sex may have been categorically measured, gender might have been measured at one dimension or another. Even some intersectional factors might have been measured. But guess what? They weren't reported in the discussion, the conclusions. They weren't necessarily discussed. So we've got a long way to go here to make sure that not only are we including sex and gender and equity, but also assessing the interactions of these things and developing more precise language around all of them and reporting them. And if you need help with that part, read the CIHR guidelines. They've been out since 2016. And that's a group of journal editors who are saying, this is what we want when you publish with our journal in the area of sex and gender reporting. Nature has quite recently upped its game and has asked for more in this area, more on your methods, more on your analyses. And I would implore you to update yourselves Quite recently, Nature has run a series of comments on the issue of sex and gender in research.
Dr. Grace, I wonder if we can continue some of this maybe a little bit later and maybe pass over to.
And these are some of the other Nature comments. I encourage you to read these. And there you have it. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I really appreciate you pulling together so much of your knowledge and experience. So I'll pass this over to Dr. Trevor Hart, who is the director of the HIV Prevention Lab and the Toronto Metropolitan University's New Hope Centre for Gender and Sexual Minority People. The centre is the first and only one in Canada dedicated to combining health research aimed at understanding disparities in sexual and gender minority health with the identification, testing, and implementation of counseling and other practice solutions for better health outcomes. So I'll pass over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I am very excited to be following Dr. Graves' work. It was really a great exposition of how we can better understand sex and gender and move away from kind of gender and sex exploitation into a much more of a liberatory approach. And if we can go to my slides. So I think what I'll be doing here is I'm going to try to expand actually on Dr. Graves' work, because I feel like some of the stuff I was going to cover has been just covered in a really wonderful way previously. And so what I thought I would do here is kind of walk you through an example of how you can do this work well. I know for a lot of people, this doesn't come naturally. I'm assuming many people who are here not because they already know all the answers and they already know how to do this work, but they're actually here instead because they're hoping to answer some questions. They're hoping to know things that we'll be talking about maybe later on in our question and answer period. They're hoping to know about how do I take that weakness in sex and gender and turn it into a strength? They're hoping to know more about how do they do certain kinds of analyses, what kind of variables would be relevant, and how do I do work that's kind of above and beyond kind of a binary kind of male-female conceptualization of sex, and certainly is something way beyond that for gender. So I'm going to kind of walk you through how we've done some of this work. And if we have time, maybe even to walk you through, like, how could you expand something that seems very simple by really doing a much more thorough SGBA plus analysis. Next slide, please. So these are some of my conflict of interest disclosures. Next slide. So I'm going to walk you through very quickly through a study that we did called the Engage Cohort Study. This is a study of men who have sex with men, and I hope it's a study where we can show that unlike what Dr. Graves has presented about how there's a lot of research that has been conducted with men who have sex with men that hasn't really paid much attention to sex and gender, despite wonderful opportunities to do so with a sexual minority population, that a lot of the work historically hasn't done that kind of work, hasn't really looked at sex or gender, and certainly not at an intersectional kind of lens. So the work that we did really, I hope, builds on that and uses much more of a SGBA plus analysis. And our study was a mixed method cohort study conducted in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. We recruited the participants through respondent-driven sampling. So it's basically a method of recruiting people where we actually know who recruited who. And it's not just a convenient sample where we can actually also be able to control for some sampling biases. So if, let's say, somebody's recruiting a lot more people and knows a lot more people, that the weight of their responses would be weighted lower than somebody who maybe doesn't know lots of people. Because what we find is that people end up recruiting people that are the most socially connected, and then you end up with a very biased sample that excludes people who are marginalized. So in this sample, we try to at least correct for some sampling biases, and we recruited men who were 16 years of age or older who reported sex with another man in the past 6 months. and the participants completed computer-assisted surveys and biomedical testing. So this was kind of a bit related to the work that was previously mentioned about kind of men who have sex with men. But what we're doing here is we're taking a look at who's more at risk for sexually transmitted infections and for HIV. And as a part of that, we are also taking a look at substance use related variables. And I'll be presenting some of that to you today. Next slide. So our sample was 2,449 guys across 3 different cities, and the recruitment period for the baseline was between 2017 and 2019. And so I'm going to be presenting to you, we did a lot of stuff in the study besides this, but one of the things we did take a look at is how is biomedical HIV prevention, for example, the use of pre-exposure prophylaxis or PrEP medications, how are those medications related to subsequent sexually transmitted infections among gay, bi, queer, and other men who have sex with men? And so I'm going to be presenting to you just a little bit of a snapshot of some of that work and maybe even how we could expand, you know, some of the work that we're doing. I'm going to choose a study that doesn't have a lot of the sex and gender-based analysis, so you could see how could we build on that kind of work. We've done that in lots of other papers, but I intentionally picked on one of my papers that you could see, like, what are ways that we could beef things up in ways that might not be intuitively obvious before this presentation, but I hope after this presentation by all of our fabulous panelists that you'll be able to see, oh wait, here's how I could do it for my future research. So in this study, we examined how PrEP use, or pre-exposure prophylaxis medication use, was associated with bacterial STIs, or sexually transmitted infections, among men who were HIV negative or they weren't sure about their HIV status at baseline. And so it was a subsample of 2,009 guys, and we were taking a look at bacterial STIs like gonorrhea, chlamydia, and syphilis with nurse-administered testing through blood, urine, throat, and rectal swabs. So in this study, you could easily see that we could just do, okay, how are medications associated with a medical outcome? And they're all men, so they're all this, you know, seemingly a homogeneous population. You could see how this could be one of those studies that Dr. Graves was complaining about, justifiably so. This could easily be one of those studies where we're just like, medical stuff is medical stuff, and there's no gender involved, and it's just, there were plenty of opportunities, but they didn't take a look at it. But as I'll try to be showing to you, we did try. Maybe we could do a better job, and maybe we do better. Maybe you'll give me some ideas from this presentation and even from our participants about how we could do a better job for our next cohort. But we did try, and I'm going to show you some examples of how we went way beyond how are medications associated with a medical outcome and really looking at this SGBA plus analysis. Next slide. So again, this kind of gives you kind of like, here's like the broad stuff that you would see when we present stuff in a medical journal, and we could have just stopped there. Okay, here's the percentage of the guys who use PrEP. And they use the PrEP medications, and did it differ by city, and did it differ by some other things that we're going to control for, and then are there any differences as far as who got gonorrhea, chlamydia, or syphilis? So yeah, we published this, and we could have stopped right then and there. And you know, maybe some people would have, but for us, we were like, okay, that's really cool. We got that out of the way. Let's do some other really cool stuff. And I'll show you some stuff that I personally think is kind of cool that's more aligned with the SGBA plus analysis in the next slide. So next slide. So again, some of you might be wondering, what does this have to do with SGBA plus analyses? It's a sample of men after all. You can't even take a look at gender or sex, right? After all, it's all men. I know that for some of you, you already know where I'm going, but that's okay. But some of you might be like, hey, I'm still struggling a little bit more and I want to know more. What could I do? Especially if I've got a sample where it's all people who identify as men at the baseline. So next slide. Well, so there's a bunch of stuff you could do. Whoops, back one slide, I think. There we go. So one thing that we could do is we have to pay attention to sampling. So when you're doing an SGBA plus analysis, you could take a look at something about your sample. So there are a bunch of ways you could take a look at things, and I'm going to give you some ideas, and there's some more that aren't even on the slide. You know, men are diverse, so men isn't a code word for people that are identified as male at birth, so that's one thing. There are different kind of sexual identities like gay or bisexual or queer or two-spirit. And there are also different gender identities like cisgender, transgender, and two-spirit can also fall for many people under gender identities. And we also looked at racial, ethnic, religious, and immigration and HIV status. So in order to be able to understand intersectional variables and how do guys that might own more than one marginalized status, how are they different from people that, let's say, maybe have fewer marginalized statuses? We're able to take a look at this. And frankly, we could have gone further as far as our sampling. We could have specifically tried to sample people that identify more on the feminine spectrum. Maybe they identify, sure, if you ask me, identify as a man, but identify as being more feminine man or a more masculine man or someone who's agender or neutral on gender. So there are a lot of ways that I could have taken a look at things, and we could have actually sampled people on what are their gendered identifications beyond labels into how feminine do you identify or how masculine as kind of a continuous trait. The other thing that we did do is we did do some intersectional analyses. So we looked at, for example, one study looked at is racialized groups or HIV status, are these related to mental health services use or non-use? And one of the interesting things is that when we looked at kind of racialized group by HIV status within this marginalized population, we actually found some things that we wouldn't have found, frankly, otherwise. So, you know, we basically found that there were indeed differences, and that mental health services use was observed among white, gay, bi, queer men versus guys that were not white. Again, there were differences by HIV status. And what we found is that a lot of times that people who were living with HIV actually had more mental health services use, but perceived discrimination, which we looked at, was kind of one of the ways in which racialized HIV negative men were less likely to use mental health services. So if they perceived HIV negative men and they were racialized, they perceived that there was going to be a lot of discrimination. Not surprisingly, they weren't going to be as likely to get mental health services. And so this is highly relevant for those of us who work within substance use, because these mental health services included substance use related services. So that worry about discrimination actually was affecting people's ability to use services. But it was more among the HIV negative guys and less among the guys who are living with HIV, likely because a lot of people living with HIV, not everybody, but in the major cities, kind of already had an into the healthcare system through their HIV status. And that's not the case, we know, countrywide, but at least in the major cities, that was the case for our participants. Another thing that we found is that racist and heterosexist experiences were both associated with concerns during COVID-19 regarding mental health. We found that people experienced COVID-19 very differently based upon whether they were Black or Asian or white, even among this gay, bi, queer men identified sample. And then they were experiencing it a lot more severely for people who were Black or Asian identified, just because of the way that racism played out in the I'm always an HIV researcher, in the COVID-19 epidemic. It actually played out differently, that people were more threatened and more judgmental of Asian people wearing masks or Black people wearing masks. So again, even in a population where you could think of the population as being singular or homogenous, there was quite a bit of diversity, and we were able to take a look at that, as well as how heterosexism was impacting upon people, which is also a gendered dynamic too. So it's telling people that because they are gay, they're kind of like not really men, and they're kind of being judged, like, oh gosh, you're going to do wrong things. You're going to engage in all those wrong behaviors by having sex with other men. We also took a look at things like differences in sexual identity groups. I know we were cautioned to not look at things through the lens of only sexual identity or gender identity, and we should be cautioned about that. But we did take a look at that. We took a look at, were there differences in mental health and sexual health among, let's say, gay versus bisexual versus queer people. And that's another way that we could kind of examine the diversity within our sample. So next slide, please. So another thing that I would recommend that people think about is gendered variables. And there's so many variables that can be gendered. And sometimes it could even be gendered biological variables. We often think about, gender must be on the sociological front and biology is on the medical front. Well, not always. For our sample, where did they have their sexually transmitted infection? Was it in their rectum because they were the receptive partner, or was it on their penis, which could be associated with being the insertive partner? Who got vaccinated for HPV, for human papillomavirus? Was it certain people? Was it based upon perceptions about heterosexism in the system? Was it associated with what kinds of sexual behaviors you engage in? Also, gendered behavioral and psychosocial variables, like engaging in sex with more partners could be considered to be something that is approved of in kind of masculine identified samples, but as often people have a double standard and frown upon more sexual behaviors among people that are more female identified. Or attitudes towards health. For example, attitudes towards condoms sometimes can be viewed as, oh, well, if you're always thinking about health behaviors, that can be gendered and can be perceived as kind of less masculine because you're concerned about things. You feel more vulnerability health-wise. As well as social variables. So we talked about gendered identities, but also gendered social experiences. We know that interpersonal violence happens in different contexts based upon femininity and masculinities. We know that people that have a more of a feminine identity might be more subject to more sexual violence. Might be subject to sometimes more concerns about violence on the streets, even depending on where their social location, as well as anti-gay or anti-queer discrimination and substance use. So, which I think is of particular interest, we took a look at how are minority stressors, so being discriminated against for kind of not living up to masculine gender norms, how is that associated with crystal meth use and alcohol use? So next slide. So there are other variables that we kind of didn't look at in quite as much, but we could have looked at sex hormone levels or biological environment. Does somebody have a flesh penis or not? Because we have a lot of folks who are transgender and might identify, even the word penis might have a different context for them, or cock might be defined in terms of something they're putting on their body, but maybe not be a part of their own biological tissues because they have not engaged in a transition that would give them that penis. So it could also be psychological variables related to gender. For example, what health behaviors did you engage in? What type of exercise? What did you do? Yoga? Did you try to increase your muscle size? Did you schedule healthcare appointments? As well as the importance of staying thin or focus on muscularity or health-related testing. These are all health-related behaviors that have a gendered component that you could examine in a lot of your work. And as well as other gendered experiences, and I kind of mentioned sexual violence as one of them, but it could be other things like job-related discrimination. So it could be things like, were you discriminated against for being a feminine man? Or were you discriminated against because of your femininity, because of your feminine identity as a transgender person or as a cisgender person? So there's a lot of stuff that we can work on. I think maybe in the interest of time, what I'll do is I'll maybe stop here and give time for some questions and answers. And we'll maybe skip over some of the future slides, but this does give you a sense of you can go way beyond the core of your work and have a very rich set of variables, analyses, sampling, and methods that all use the SGBA plus analyses. And maybe I'll end my presentation here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hart. That was really a wonderful presentation, and I appreciate the complexity of doing the type of work that you're doing at both examining sex and gender and the intersectionality therein. I know we are running out of time, but I had a question for both presenters, if I may. I'm going to go out on a limb and just ask this question, and then we're going to have to wrap it up because we're over time. So I'm just going to ask this one question about guidelines for publishing around SGBA+. And the interesting thing is lots of publishing companies, journals, for example, book publishers don't actually have that in their editorial policy. So this is a question for both Dr. Graves and Dr. Hart. If you could just briefly talk a little bit about your suggestions on sort of closing the knowledge bookends around why SGBA+ should be funded and should be done. That is pretty clear and based on your wonderful presentations. But what can we do around publishing and SGBA+? So over to you for your very brief comments, and then we'll have to wrap it up. Thank you. Lorraine, did you want to start us off?
Sure. I think enlarging the number of journals that take this on as a policy and follow the CIHR guidelines is one thing. And that can be done, I think, in a couple of ways. It can be, direct lobbying of those journal editors and really involving journal editors more closely in these kinds of deliberations around sex and gender science, I think is really, really helpful. I think the other thing is coming from the other direction. A lot of the work we end up doing is using evidence that has some sex and gender evidence in it so that we can move forward and build on it, which essentially ignores, in some areas, the majority of what's published. So I think that's the message to researchers. If you want your research to be noticed and to be built upon, it's useful to get it into the SGBA+ and ask the kinds of questions that both Trevor and I were indicating need to be asked.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Lorraine. And I'll turn it over to you, Trevor, for the final word on the how do we get SGBA+ in more publications. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is all of your objectives don't have to be directly related to SGBA+, but it would be great if it was a big part of the work that you do, because whether we like it or not, we're all a part of a sex and gendered world. And so certainly in substance use research, there's so many wonderful opportunities for you to think of it not as a burden, but as a way to expand your number of publications, a way to kind of do richer work that really gets into the heart of what are people actually thinking? Because we did grow up in a gendered world, and we do grow up with sex. And so what do we do to kind of expand the realm of what we do so that we can design much more nuanced and tailored interventions to support the people that I hope we're all trying to support regarding substance use.
Amazing. Thanks so much for that, Trevor. I am just going to hand it over briefly to Jennifer with a gentle reminder about the evaluation. So Jennifer, if you wouldn't mind.
Or I think it's me that's going to take over from here. Sorry.
Right. Sorry. Thanks, Mark. Over to you.
Yeah. So first of all, just want to thank all of our speakers today, Dr. Angela Kaida and Dr. Elsabe du Plessis from CIHR Institute for Gender and Health, our panelists, Dr. Lorena Graves and Dr. Trevor Hart, and our moderators, Dr. Jack Gehagen and Dr. Nikki Kepik. And thank you all for attending the session today. We obviously did not get enough time to do questions. That's obviously on us to do a better job of regulating that. But so if people do have questions, for those of you that have stayed to the very end here, please feel free to send the questions to us. You can send it to Jennifer or others, and we can direct them to the speakers and have a conversation that way. And hopefully that can occur. There is an evaluation form, and I encourage you to complete this form so that we can understand your experiences and perspectives on our webinar, and maybe things that we can consider if we are doing this again. I also want to remind everyone that there's a webinar link that's at the CRISM Atlantic website, www.crism-alt.ca, and so you can find this webinar to watch again, or to consult with as needed. And so I think that is where we'll stop today. In terms of the recording, we're going to stop the recording now and have Elder Sheila Nyman give us a closing of our webinar today, but we'll stop the recording now, and I'll thank Elder Sheila in advance. So it's over to you, Elder Sheila.